December of 1777, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. 12,000 men entered this camp several weeks earlier. They have no shoes, no blankets, no food. Typhus, dysentery, starvation. Every month Valley Forge claims hundreds. Soldiers wrap their feet in rags and animal skins, just to keep their toes from freezing. The smell of disease and wood smoke hangs over rows of crude log huts, like a fog that refuses to lift. 18 miles away, the British Army, the most disciplined fighting force on the planet, is quartered in warm Philadelphia. Hot meals, clean beds. Two different universes separated by a single day of marching. They know the Americans are dying out there in the snow. They are content to wait. George Washington walks through the camp and sees the truth. If something does not change right now, this winter the American Revolution will end here. Not with a battle, not with a surrender. It will simply freeze to death. What Washington does not yet know is that the man who will save his army is already on his way. He has crossed the Atlantic. He carries a letter of recommendation, a silver star, and one enormous lie. Almost everything written in that letter is false. Friends, hello. With you is West Bell, and today we are going to talk about the most improbable savior in American military history. A man who should never have been allowed anywhere near an army, let alone given command of one. Friedrich von Steuben, the Prussian officer who was never actually a general, who was dismissed from his own army as redundant, who, by the age of 47, had no money, no job, and no prospects. And yet this man, with his fabricated title, his complete inability to speak English, and his Italian greyhound named Azor, arrived in a collapsing rebel camp and transformed a mob of hungry militiamen into soldiers capable of standing against the British Empire. This is not just a war story. It is a story about how the greatest achievements sometimes begin with the greatest deceptions, and about how real skill will always, eventually, overwhelm fake credentials. But to understand the scale of what Steuben accomplished, we first need to go to Prussia, to the court of Frederick the Great. Mid-18th century Prussia was not really a country. It was an army that happened to own a state. Voltaire once joked that where other nations possess an army, the Prussian army possesses a nation. He was not far wrong. The Prussian military machine was the most feared in Europe. Discipline was absolute. Maneuvers were calibrated to the centimeter. Soldiers moved as a single organism. The infantry could reload muskets 3 times faster than any opponent. The cavalry attacked with a precision that made enemy generals physically ill. At the center of this machine stood Frederick II, Frederick the Great. Warrior king, philosopher king, the man who transformed Prussia from a second-rate kingdom into a European power. He personally commanded armies, designed tactical systems, and wrote treatises on the art of war. And this was the world into which our protagonist was born. Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben. Too many names for a man destined to become a legend under a much shorter title. Simply, the Baron. His father was a captain in the Prussian Engineering Corps. Military service was inherited like a family business. Young Friedrich grew up among cannons, barracks, and marching columns. He was not raised to be a merchant or a scholar. He was raised to kill. At 14, he watched his father direct siege operations at Prague. A teenager observing walls crumble under artillery fire. Imagine what that does to a mind. At 17, he was already in the army, junior cadet, the bottom of the officer ladder. Then, in 1756, the 7 Years' War began. The 7 Years' War was essentially the first world war in human history. It spanned Europe, North America, India, the Caribbean. Prussia fought Austria, Russia, France, Saxony, and Sweden simultaneously. One country against half the continent. And, astonishingly, Prussia held. Frederick the Great raced between fronts, delivering blows that military historians still study in academies. Rossbach, Leuthen, Zorndorf, every engagement a textbook of tactical genius. Beside him, in staff tents and on forced marches, was the young Steuben. He served as an infantry officer, a staff officer. He rose to captain. But more importantly, he was admitted to Frederick the Great's elite officer school. Consider the level of education. The finest army in Europe, the finest commander of the age, your instructor. You do not learn logistics, tactics, drill, supply systems from books. You witness them every day. You breathe them. Steuben absorbed everything, every detail, every principle. How to build an army, how to feed an army, how to move an army, how to turn a crowd of armed peasants into a combat unit. And then the war ended. 1763. Prussia had won at unimaginable cost. The army was downsized. Thousands of officers were dismissed. Among them Captain von Steuben, aged 33. And here begins what I call the Great Pause. 14 years. 14 long, humiliating years of Steuben trying to find work. He took a position as court chamberlain to a minor German prince. The title of baron was acquired there in 1764. It was not a military honor. It was a court decoration with a fancy label. Almost no money. Zero prospects. He accompanied the prince to France to borrow money. Unsuccessfully. They returned to Germany even poorer. He knocked on doors in Austria, in Baden, in France. "Good day, I am a Prussian officer. I served under Frederick the Great. Might you have need of—" No. Next. Peacetime Europe had no use for soldiers. Armies were shrinking, not expanding. Steuben was a warrior without a war, a surgeon without a patient, a man who knew only one thing: how to build armies in a world that did not want armies. By 1777 he was 47 years old, broke, exhausted. 14 years of knocking on closed doors. And then news arrived from across the Atlantic. The British colonies had rebelled. A ragtag group of insurgents was fighting the British Empire. They desperately needed professional soldiers. Steuben went to Paris. Paris in the late 1770s was the center of the world, and simultaneously the center of intrigue. France had not yet officially entered the war on the American side, but it was already actively helping money, weapons, volunteers. Foreign Minister Vergennes and War Minister Saint-Germain were watching events across the ocean intently. They understood. If the Americans win, Britain receives a mortal wound. If they lose, a once-in-a-century opportunity is squandered. Steuben arrived in Paris and, through old connections, reached Saint-Germain. The French minister saw potential. Prussian schooling, 7 years' war experience, proximity to Frederick the Great. This was exactly what the Americans desperately lacked. Saint-Germain arranged a meeting. Sitting at the table were 2 American diplomats, Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane. They had been in Paris for months, and they had a problem. A serious problem. The moment word had spread through Europe that the Americans were seeking military specialists, an endless line had formed at Franklin and Deane's door. Retired majors, bankrupt counts, adventurers of every description, all of them demanding high ranks and enormous salaries, almost all of them useless. Congress had already sent instructions: no more foreigners with contracts for brigadier general in their luggage. Enough. They had been burned badly enough. So the first meeting with Steuben goes terribly. Deane asks questions and looks interested. Franklin sits with a bored expression, then abruptly cuts off the conversation. "We have no work for you. That is it." Point final. Steuben has just been dismissed, politely, diplomatically, but unambiguously. 14 years of searching, the last hope. door closed. But now the French government intervenes. Senior officials in the War Ministry see what Franklin missed. Standing before them is a man trained in Frederick the Great's school. Not an adventurer, not a fortune seeker, a professional. They persuade Franklin and Dean to reconsider, and then the three of them, Franklin, Dean, and Saint-Germain, devise a plan. Franklin and Dean write a letter of recommendation for Steuben to carry to America. In this letter, he is described as a lieutenant general in the service of the King of Prussia. This is not true. Steuben left the Prussian army as a captain, not a general, not a lieutenant general, a captain. The letter also exaggerates his closeness to Frederick the Great, implying he was something like the right hand of the king. Also not true. Steuben served on the staff, yes, but the right hand? No. Historian Thomas Fleming would later call this letter the greatest public fraud ever perpetrated for a good cause. Steuben did not write those lines himself, but he accepted them, and later, on American soil, he added a few refinements of his own. For example, he claimed he had turned down paid positions in the Holy Roman Empire to serve America. Also not true. He was penniless and unemployed. But here is the detail everyone misses. The deception was not about vanity. It was strategic. Franklin knew, if Steuben arrived as a former captain, Congress would not even grant him a hearing. Just another retiree. But a lieutenant general who served under Frederick the Great, that is a name. That carries weight. That is someone worth listening to. And to sweeten the deal, Steuben makes a brilliant move. He offers to serve without pay. As a volunteer, he asks only to be compensated after the war, and only if America wins. Congress, exhausted by foreign officers demanding salaries, is thrilled. The deal is struck. Steuben sails for America. September of 1777. The frigate Flamand departs from a French port. On board, Baron von Steuben, 4 French assistant translators, military secretary Pierre-Étienne Duponceau, and an Italian greyhound named Azor. Yes, you heard that correctly. A dog. A small, elegant dog that follows the Baron everywhere. Picture this scene. A 50-year-old Prussian with a fake rank speaking no English, crossing the Atlantic with 4 Frenchmen and a decorative lapdog to save the American army. Absurd. Completely absurd. And yet there he is, on the deck, looking west. When they land in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in December of 1777, they are nearly arrested. Steuben and his entourage are dressed in bright red uniforms, and the locals mistake them for British officers. They have to explain, no, we are not the enemy. We are, well, friends. Probably. The misunderstanding is resolved, and news of the Prussian Lieutenant General spreads instantly. In Boston, John Hancock hosts a dinner in his honor. Samuel Adams discusses politics and military affairs with him. Everyone is impressed by this large, imposing man with the silver star on his chest, engraved with a single word, fidelitas, loyalty. He looks like a general, talks like a general, moves with the confidence of a man who has commanded thousands. And now pay attention. This is the most important moment. February 23rd, 1778. Baron von Steuben rides into the encampment of the Continental Army at Valley Forge. George Washington personally rides out on horseback to meet him. Picture the scene. Pennsylvania winter, rows of crude log huts, soldiers wrapped in torn blankets. Many are barefoot. Some have wrapped their feet in rags and animal skins simply to avoid frostbite. The smell of sickness, smoke, despair. And in rides this man. An enormous figure on an enormous horse. Silver star on his chest. Pistol holsters larger than anyone else's. The bearing that only decades of drill service can produce. One Continental soldier later wrote that the newcomer looked like the perfect personification of Mars, the ancient Roman god of war. Washington is cautious but intrigued. He writes that the Baron appears to be a gentleman and, as far as he can judge, a man of military knowledge. Within 2 weeks, Washington appoints Steuben acting Inspector General and asks him to study the general and asks him to study the condition of the army. What Steuben discovers horrifies him. The camp is a catastrophe. Latrines dug wherever convenient, sometimes directly next to the kitchens. Dead horses rotting in the open air. No standardized drill manual. What Steuben discovers horrifies him. The camp is a catastrophe. Latrines dug wherever convenient, sometimes directly next to the kitchens. Dead horses rotting in the open air. No standardized drill manual. Every regiment does things differently. Some men cannot form a line. Others do not know how to reload a musket. And bayonets? Bayonets, the primary close combat weapon of 18th century warfare? Steuben later writes, "The American soldier never used this arm. He had no faith in it. He used it only to roast his beefsteak over the fire." The British Army won battles with bayonet charges. A line of redcoats advancing with fixed bayonets, and the Americans broke every time, dropped their weapons, and ran. Steuben, looking at this, understands. Either he teaches these men to fight, or in a few months they will all be dead. But here is what is incredible. The years of Prussian training, those are real. The time spent in Frederick the Great's staff, real. The education in the elite officer academy, real. He may not have been a lieutenant general, but he was a brilliantly trained military professional, and he knew how to build an army from scratch. Steuben gets to work. Now, most European generals of the 18th century wrote instructions, handed them to junior officers, and walked away. They did not dirty their boots training enlisted men. That was below their dignity. Sergeants handled that. Steuben did the exact opposite. Every morning before dawn, the Baron is already on the parade ground. Full-dress uniform, medals, polished boots. He stands in the mud, in the cold, face to face with privates and corporals. And he shows them personally, with his own hands, how to hold a musket, how to stand at attention, how to march at 75 steps per minute, and then at 120 steps per minute. He walks down the line, adjusts each soldier's grip, physically moves their arms and legs into the correct position. He teaches them to form lines and columns, to wheel without breaking formation, to change direction without losing order. And bayonet drill. The same bayonet they had been using as a meat skewer. Steuben turns it into a weapon that the enemy will run from. In the Prussian army, these were basic skills. In the Continental Army, it looked like sorcery. Now, here is a detail that explains everything. Steuben had a problem. He barely spoke English. Every evening he wrote instructions in French, the military language of Europe. His secretary Du Ponceau translated them into English with the help of two of Washington's aides, Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. Yes, you heard that correctly. Alexander Hamilton. The same Hamilton, future Secretary of the Treasury, face on the $10 bill, sat up at night translating a drill manual from French into English. By morning, the translation was ready. The soldiers received their instructions. And when things went wrong on the parade ground, when soldiers got confused, ignored commands, or simply were not doing what they were told, Steuben would erupt. He would scream. First in German, then in French. Then he would turn to his aide and roar, "My dear Du Ponceau, come here and curse for me in English. These fellows do not do what I order them." The soldiers loved it. They thought it was hilarious. But most importantly, it worked. Because Steuben was not just teaching them drill. He was building morale, creating camaraderie, turning demoralized strangers into a team. Eventually he learned enough English to curse on his own, and his thunderous voice, echoing across the parade ground with newly acquired profanity, became the most recognizable sound of Valley Forge. But there was something else. A brilliant organizational move. Steuben created what he called a model company. 100 soldiers from different brigades, plus 50 men from Washington's personal guard. 150 men. He did not just train these 150 and call it done. He trained them to become instructors. As soon as the model company mastered the exercises, those soldiers returned to their regiments and taught everyone else. A chain reaction of competence, like a virus, except a virus of discipline. Knowledge spread outward, engulfing the entire army. Within 2 months, the transformation was complete. Soldiers who in December did not know which end of a musket to hold were now marching in tight formation, reloading with speed and precision, and executing bayonet charges that would have made a Prussian sergeant proud. But Steuben did not stop at drill. He reorganized the entire camp. Latrines moved them downhill on the opposite side from the kitchens. Standardized camp layout and sanitation implement immediately. Disease rates plummeted. He created a system where company commanders were directly responsible for training recruits, and the best sergeants conducted real instruction sessions. And here is the crucial point. Historians say that Steuben's greatest gift was not bayonet training and not the drill manual. It was the creation of the American non-commissioned officer corps, the sergeants, the backbone of the army, to this day. May 5th, 1778. Washington organized a military parade at Valley Forge to celebrate the news. France had officially recognized American independence and was entering the war as an ally. Washington expected a sloppy, awkward display. Instead, he watched in stunned silence as his troops marched with crisp precision, executing maneuvers that would have looked at home on a Prussian parade ground. The transformation was not merely noticeable, it was undeniable. Exactly 1 year later, May 5th, 1779, Congress officially appointed Steuben Inspector General with the rank of Major General. The former captain who had arrived with forged documents now held a real general's rank. Earned. Not purchased. Not inherited. Earned. June of 1778. The Continental Army marches out of Valley Forge and meets the British at Monmouth in central New Jersey. The day is brutally hot. Temperatures approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers are collapsing from heat stroke. The initial American advance is led by General Charles Lee, who almost immediately orders a retreat. The reasons are still debated by historians. Washington is furious. He rides forward through the chaos, halts the retreating troops, and orders them to turn around and fight. And they turn around. For the first time in the entire war, the Continental Army fights as a single disciplined force. They use artillery, intelligently, with overlapping fields of fire. They hold formation under withering musket fire, the same fire that had broken them 6 months earlier. And then the British come forward with the bayonet. This is the moment of truth. A British infantry bayonet charge, the thing that had shattered American lines in every previous engagement. Redcoats advancing with fixed steel, a wall of blades, inexorable, deadly. And the Americans do not run. They counterattack. Soldiers who learned bayonet combat from a Prussian instructor on the frozen fields of Valley Forge now use those same skills in the furnace of New Jersey. Bayonet against bayonet, chest to chest. Many historians consider Monmouth a tactical draw. That does not matter. The battle proved something far more significant. The army that was freezing and starving 6 months earlier was now capable of standing face to face with the best army in the world, and not backing down. One historian later wrote, "In earlier times the Continentals would probably have fled. After Valley Forge, after Steuben, they never even considered the possibility." July of 1779. Stony Point. General Anthony Wayne, known as Mad Anthony for his reckless aggression, leads a night assault on a British fortification perched on a rocky promontory above the Hudson River. Wayne's soldiers had undergone intensive bayonet training under Steuben, and they go into the attack with unloaded muskets. Think about that. They cross hundreds of yards of open ground in the dark, wade through water, climb steep cliffs, and capture the British garrison exclusively with bayonets. Not a single shot fired. The very weapon that 18 months earlier had been used to roast meat over campfires. The British resist fiercely. Hand-to-hand combat inside the fort lasts 15 minutes. Then the garrison surrenders. The victory is stunning. It sends a signal to both armies. American troops are now capable of meeting British regulars in the most terrifying form of 18th century close combat. One historian called Stony Point the most brilliant engagement of the American Revolution. And between Monmouth and Stony Point, Steuben writes a book, Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, known as the Blue Book, the first standardized military manual of the American Army. Everything was in it. How to march and set camp, how to load and fire, how to organize a regiment, how to maintain discipline, how sergeants should train soldiers. Steuben wrote in French. Hamilton and Nathaniel Greene helped translate into English. Congress approved the book in March of 1779. Copies were distributed to every company, to every officer. The Blue Book remained the official manual of the United States Army until 1814, more than 35 years. Its influence lasted even longer, shaping American military doctrine for decades. The fake general wrote the real textbook for the entire United States Army. Let that sink in. Yorktown, 1781. The final act. Steuben commands one of Washington's 3 divisions at the siege that brings Britain to its knees. When General Cornwallis surrenders with 8,000 soldiers, Steuben is standing there alongside Washington. The soldiers who held the siege, who dug the trenches and stormed the redoubts, they fought with the same discipline and precision that Steuben had drilled into them 3 years earlier. But the end of Steuben's story is not the triumphant finale you might expect. The man who saved the Continental Army spent his final years struggling with money. Remember, he had agreed to serve without pay, on the understanding that Congress would compensate him after the war. Congress did allocate him substantial sums, but Steuben managed to spend them faster than they arrived. The habit of living grandly never left him. He lived in Manhattan, moved in high society, attended receptions and dinners with the same elegance that had once dazzled congressmen. But expenses exceeded income. Only in 1790 did Congress finally grant him a pension, $2,500 a year. Alexander Hamilton and other friends helped sort out the debts and land. Steuben moved to a modest estate near the town of Remsen in upstate New York. There he lived out his final years quietly, far from the glory and noise of the war that had defined him. The man who had once strutted across Valley Forge in a glittering parade uniform now lived in a simple farmhouse. He never married. He had no children. When he died on November 28, 1794, at the age of 64, he left his estate to 2 former aides-de-camp, William North and Benjamin Walker. He was buried in a grove on his own land. In 1783, George Washington wrote his final letter as American Commander-in-Chief to General Steuben. He thanked him for his faithful and meritorious service. Today, a statue of Steuben stands at Valley Forge. Another stands in Lafayette Park, directly across from the White House. Towns across the country bear his name: Steuben County, New York; Steuben County, Indiana; the city of Steubenville, Ohio. Every September, German Americans celebrate von Steuben Day in honor of the man who crossed an ocean to fight for a country that was not his own. Yes, his credentials were fake. His rank was fabricated. His closeness to Frederick the Great was exaggerated. But the skills were real. The knowledge was real. The transformation he accomplished was undeniable, measurable, and proven in battle after battle. He took an army that did not know how to use a bayonet and turned them into soldiers capable of winning a fight with nothing but bayonets. He wrote the book that defined the face of the American army for a generation. He built the system that still echoes in the voice of every drill sergeant and the authority of every non-commissioned officer. Friedrich von Steuben was a fraud, and he was also the single most important military instructor in American history. The country he helped create could never have won its independence without him. Sometimes the right person for the job is the one who has to lie just to get the interview. Thank you for watching to the end. If this story surprised you, subscribe to West Bell. New documentary videos on the Revolutionary War every week. And tell me in the comments, what do you think broke the British harder? The discipline Steuben brought, Washington's tactical genius, or the simple fact that fighting a war 3,000 miles from home against people defending their own land is a problem no empire can solve? See you in the next one.